How did Rembrandt's Night Watch become an emblem for mental handicap, and what does Michel Foucault have to do with it? Well, on the 15th of January 1976, the artist Robert Lenkiewicz visited Milford Special School to see the class for severely mentally handicapped and autistic children. In the same month, he tried helping a crippled boy to walk and noted with sadness the limitations of his amateur physiotherapy. Conversations on this and similar cases with his friend, the paediatrician Dr. Hans de Rijke, suggested that the problems of mental handicap were often social and economic as much as physiological. The painter had boundless admiration for the paediatrician, and their friendship was cemented by the stoical recognition that some of life's tragedies are inevitable and irreversible, and others are not, but there's just not the political will to reverse things. The theoretical elements of Lenkiewicz's massive mental handicap project received a dramatic boost on the 13th of February 1976 with the arrival in his library of Foucault's monumental book, Madness and Civilization. The introduction to the translation was written by the radical psychiatrist David Cooper, who in 1965 established the Philadelphia Association, working with fellow psychiatrist R.D. Laing, and they attempted to redefine the understanding and treatment of psychosis and mental disorders, which they saw as the response of sane individuals to intolerable social pressures. Laing met Lenkiewicz, I think, on only one occasion that I know of, briefly, but they knew of each other's work and they admired each other's work immensely. Lenkiewicz never met Foucault, but he was very impressed by Foucault's style of living as much as the scale and the acuity of his thought. Like Lenkiewicz, Foucault's creative output and experimental sexuality was truly first-rate. Philosophy for Foucault was not a matter of lofty abstraction, but a means of living a significant life. Madness and Civilization, a gigantic book which cuts through the hallowed notions of moral or scientific progress in the field of mental handicap, and the amoral dissection of evidence in Foucault's work, is in a lot of ways reminiscent of Lenkiewicz's approach to scholarship. I think this is because of the common ancestor of Nietzsche, especially the methods of genealogy and value critique. And of course, both Lenkiewicz and Foucault enjoyed working on a large scale. The bigger the project, the better. The range of Foucault's book is huge, even in the cut-down English version that Robert was working with. And I'm afraid I'm going to summarise it here, which means doing it considerable violence to capture part of its main argument. Throughout the Renaissance, madness was not merely evaluated in a different way. It was an entirely different object of inquiry. The unreason of the Shakespearean fool or rustic idiot was seen as a valuable counterpoint to the working of reason, and reason itself was acknowledged to be a limited tool. Although Foucault does not himself stress the point, the mentally handicapped of the Renaissance had a social role, not unlike the traditional seer or tribal shaman even, with access to a different but important kind of wisdom. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century framed a drastic change in the relationship between folly and good sense. The terms were slowly but surely dragged further apart and loaded with moral evaluations, so the figure of the holy fool, which Robert Lenkiewicz so admired, was eclipsed. Fools and zanies were now subject to diagnosis and confinement and treatment by the growing ranks of professional disciplinarians. The hospital and the insane asylum rose to swallow the growing numbers of urban nonconformists to reason. They were no longer fools. They were the insane. Reason was increasingly characterized as a military encampment, defending society against unreason. A hostility emerges, with mental handicap or madness refigured as a threat to be contained or an enemy to be fought. The offending fools were driven or taken away from their families, villages or city streets to be cured in workhouses or exhibited in asylums. Foucault calls this the Great Confinement, in which the distinction between the mad and the sane was made by physical separation and by the professional helpers who profited from the system. Now, we must be clear that, in Foucault's view, medical and judicial power is not cynical and evil, nor is it transparently benevolent. The notion of medical power and knowledge is complex in Foucault, and the black and white good or bad sort of notion doesn't really fit it. Foucault, like Lenkiewicz, wishes to analyse situations without resorting to moral categories at all, if possible. So, according to Foucault, the modern treatment of the mentally ill in special institutions is radically different from former centuries. While this can hardly be attributed to a triumph of lofty morals, it's not outright fascism either. But the mentally handicapped have been made less visible, uncommunicative, whereas 500 years ago, no European town or royal court would be without its more or less well-integrated collection of fools and crazies. Lenkiewicz's choice of his ironic version of the Night Watch as a centrepiece for the mental handicapped exhibition makes more sense considering Foucault's analysis. For Rembrandt's The Night Watch was not originally a night painting at all. It acquired the title and the reputation due to some well-intentioned buffoon lathering it in dark varnish in the early 1600s. This drastic change in tone sanctioned a general forgetting of the painting's original title, which emphasised the work as first and foremost a military painting. This was the officers and men of the Amsterdam Cloveniers militia, the company of Captain Frans Banningkock. The gentlemen portrayed were in effect very wealthy private police officers or vigilantes, a self-selecting band of well-heeled and well-meaning citizens armed against the enemies of the civic order, real or imaginary, internal or external. As with the town crier in Plymouth mourning over its unfortunates, the authority figures in Robert's version of the Night Watch are not at all villainous. They're merely constrained by their roles in an economic and political order which diverts their goodwill and best efforts into a collusion with silence. So, when Robert invited the Lord Mayor of Plymouth to unveil the Night Watch in the Jacob's Ladder studio in August 1976, the gesture was more nuanced and generous than the dramatic scene where Corder's Rembrandt rages against the vanity and stupidity of the disgruntled officials. Mr. Moore, the headmaster of Milford School, and Hans de Reiche were held in high regard by Robert. And it's interesting that Hans is painted in the costume of a more humane age. Mr. Moore's attire is more ambiguous, but his expression and his pose suggest strength and possibility. He appears to be presenting options. Even the political classes are not entirely mocked in Robert's depiction. The Devonport MP, Dr. David Owen, who was then Minister of State for Health, looks determined, if somewhat melancholy and clueless. He holds a T-square used in technical drawing and building, also in Masonic and vernacular use as a symbol of fair dealings, but his thick white sash seems more custodial than ceremonial. He seems to be a man with plans, but ironically confined by his official powers. One more irony must be noted. Robert's image of armed men, or builders planning the exclusion of unreason, is doubly poignant, for no matter how wise or well-intentioned the players, all attempts to outbuild the night, the darkness, are a folly of wisdom. This theme Robert developed in later paintings, such as the Project 18 Aristotle and Phyllis series, and for reasons or unreasons beyond the scope of this little talk, the shooting company or the Night Watch has been a magnet for persons of defective judgment, armed with more than dark varnish, for as long as it's been around. It's not quite a cursed painting, but Rembrandt's canvas was stabbed in 1911, severely slashed, and I quote, in accordance with orders from the Lord, by another attacker in 1975. It was sprayed with acid by another escaped psychiatric patient in 1990. Robert saw the original canvas still under repair during his trip to the Netherlands that same year, and Lenkiewicz's version, along with the entirety of Chilford Hall in Cambridgeshire, was incinerated in 2012 by a vengeful drug addict and his autistic accomplice.